The aim of Muslims is to live their lives according to the revealed will and guidance of God, as it is contained in the principal source, the Qur'an. On the surface of it, we might expect that this would make it easy to decide the right and wrong way to behave in every situation. Simply find one verse that mentions a particular teaching and take that as the definitive statement. In reality, it is much more complicated. For one thing, the Quran was sent down upon the heart of Muhammad over a period of 22 years. It rarely says everything there is to say on a particular subject at any one time. It sometimes reveals divine guidance gradually. What's more, revelations are made in a particular circumstance or situation, and often need to be interpreted in the light of a certain context. We can't understand the fullness of the guidance unless we know what these contexts were. These have been recorded from the earliest days of Islam as the Asbabul Nuzul, or the occasions of revelation. To be clear what effect the Quranic revelation was intended to have involves the study of these occasions, together with the life, times, and society of Muhammad. Of course, Muhammad was the first and best interpreter of the Quran. Everything he said, taught, did, and approved of was a practical illustration of how his life was shaped by the Quran. His life was the shining example of correct behavior, known as the Sunnah, for everyone to follow. The Sunnah of the Prophet is the second source of guidance as to how human beings should live. Whilst Muhammad was alive, he could be asked directly for his judgment on any question which might arise. After his death, new ways had to be found to resolve these questions and issues which inevitably arise as times change. These had to be based on the Quran and Sunnah. In fact, both the Quran and Sunnah tell us that these interpretations should be worked out using our God-given faculty of reason. This is exactly what scholars have been doing down the centuries since Muhammad's death. In so doing, they have worked out a clear path of correct conduct for Muslims to follow. This path is essentially one, although there are some variations between the different schools. This code of conduct is the Shari'a, which literally means a well-trodden path leading to a definite goal. Following the Shari'a will make for a happy, fulfilled life on earth and lead to heaven after death. The Shari'a, as developed by generations of scholars, ranges over many aspects of life: personal, family, legal, economic, and social actions. Even so, following it is not something which comes quickly or easily, but is part of a lifelong struggle, or jihad, towards getting closer to God in actions, thoughts, and feelings. The underlying principles of the Shari'a never change. However, these need to be applied afresh in new circumstances as they arise. The need continuously to strive for understanding of the Quran led to the discipline of Quranic commentary, or tafsir, which is practiced by learned scholars. Over 14 centuries, many tafsir have been written. Naturally, some differences of methodology have developed: linguistic, historical, traditional, philosophical, mystical, etc. The Shia believe that the Imams were infallible, so they could give both definitive interpretations of the Quran and articulate new guidance based on it. The Sunnah of Muhammad is his customary practice, what he did, said, taught, and the things of which he approved. In recognition of the critical importance of this, Muhammad's companions made sure to remember everything in minute detail. These records are the traditions or hadith of Muhammad. Muhammad made it clear when he was speaking in his own right as the Prophet, and when he was conveying the revelation from God in the Qur'an. The two were quite distinct. As each hadith was memorized and taught to others, a chain of transmitters, or isnad, developed. These were carefully preserved as proof of the authenticity of the hadith. What's more, painstaking research has been undertaken to check that the connections in the chain were valid, and that every person involved was of sound character and pious life, so that their word could be trusted. Malik ibn Anas was the first to give us a written deposit of hadith. He lived in Medina and was a descendant of one of the companions of Muhammad. In Baghdad, Ahmed ibn Hanbal was reported to have memorized 1,000,000 hadiths and left a collection of around 40,000 called the Musnad. Schools of law were named after both of them. As early as the 9th century, due to the availability of mass-produced quantities of paper, it became possible to write down great systematic collections arranged around particular topics. The hadith were classified into categories according to the reliability of their chain of transmission. The highest classification was for those hadith which were sound and without defects, or sahih. The next category down was Hasan, good and reliable, but not as well authenticated as a sahih, and so on. Further down the scale, we have classifications covering cases where there is a break or uncertainty in the chain of communication. These are weak hadith, or da'if, and can only be used in law as supportive evidence. There are 6 major collections of Sunni hadith. The most important two are those drawn up by al-Bukhari and Muslim. These contain thousands of hadith, all of which are classified as sahih. For the shi'a, the infallible imams are the guarantors of the authenticity of the hadith. Each is traced back to one of them. The confusion of the early centuries renders the tracing back of chains of transmitters to the Prophet unreliable for the Shia. They prefer to rely on the infallible word of one of the Imams. The great Shia collections of hadith, like Al-Kafi, date from the 10th century. There have always been, and will always be, situations in life which pose questions that are not addressed directly by the Qur'an and Sunnah of Muhammad, but need to be deduced from it. In these cases, it is believed that the Prophet approved the use of personal judgment, or ra'i. This was common in the 1st century of Islam, and spread rapidly to cover societies far from Medina. From it emerged a systematic procedure, based on the principle of analogical reasoning, or qiyas. Here the process was to compare the new issue with one that resembled it, which had already been determined. A new judgment was then developed to deal with a new question. This approach was accepted in most schools of Islam as a third source of Shari'a, but it was strongly forbidden by Shia scholars, who preferred to use deductive logic instead. However, such judgments are one stage removed from the two principal sources, and so, even for the Sunnis, future rulings could not be based solely on them, but had to be rooted in the Qur'an and the Sunnah of Muhammad. However, for the Shia, deductive logic remains an enduring source.
In Sunni Islam, analogy was considered as the best way to understand how to broaden the scope of the law without overdoing it. They had this idea that in deductive logic you go through generalities, and there is a risk that you would go into too general statements and prohibitions. So it's better to see how one particular prohibition coming from the Quran or the Prophet can be used to approach another particular problem without going through general principles. We know that the Quran forbids alcohol, wine. Does it forbid all kinds of alcohol? Or how are we going to look at drugs, for example? They are not forbidden literally in the Quran or in the Hadith. Have we got to go through a general rule, but then are we risking to forbid things that God would not have forbidden? Or are we going to proceed very carefully from one particular case to another particular case? Scholars will say, oh, wine was forbidden because it leads to an alteration of the mind. So if there is a similar alteration of the mind in drugs, so by analogy, that drug will also be forbidden without having to go through general rules. It's just a principle of carefulness. We want to make sure that we do not forbid things that are not forbidden without, on the other hand, considering that everything should be allowed as such. There are still things that indeed deserve to be forbidden because they are totally opposed to the kind of human life or to the ideals of humanity that the Quran goes for.
Deductive logic is a sort of argument which leads us to definitive answer, and that's why in Shiite fiqh it is only deductive logic which is acceptable, which gives definitive answers, as opposed to analogy, which involves a sort of speculation in it. Just to give a very common example, if we say every animal dies and horse is an animal, therefore horse dies, this is an argument of deductive logic. And the answer is quite definitive. Because horse is an animal and because we know that every animal dies, therefore the answer is quite clear. Analogy is like when we say every horse dies, cat is like a horse in many aspects, therefore every cat dies. Well, we can say that to some extent this is true, but there is room for speculation here, because it is possible that a cat is not like a horse in all aspects, and including death. Shia jurists say that we do not need to resort to analogy to get speculative answers for our practical issues. If there is no ruling in religion, in jurisprudence for a certain thing, then we just take it out of the realm of religious rulings, and we are free to act in that respect without any restriction, without seeking resort to speculation.
This scholarly intellectual activity continued in the Sunni schools, with one scholar refining the reasoning of another until a consensus or ijma on legal matters was reached. This consensus of the scholars eventually led to a wider, more general agreement, the consensus of the community. This consensus was considered to be a solid foundation for Sunni Islamic law on which later generations could build, a position supported by a hadith of Muhammad, saying that the Muslim community would never agree on an error. In the Sunni schools, during the time when a consensus is emerging, there is a legitimate diversity of interpretation. Where there is no universal consensus, the rule is to accept the legitimate diversity.
Consensus is possible only on very broad concepts and issues. You never can have consensus on very narrow issues, and therefore diversity would always be there. That's why in Islam, anyone who utters that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger is regarded to be a Muslim, no matter what type of conception of God they have, what type of idea about Muhammad they have, what type of jurisprudence they follow, what type of theology they have. It's all included into these two very broad concepts about which consensus is necessary in a Muslim society or in a Muslim community, and that is the unity of God and that Muhammad is his messenger. If we have this concept that we have, and if we really emphasize on it, I think we can have great diversity in Muslim societies. And this is what historically has been perceived in different areas in Muslim countries and Muslim societies. They had different cultures, they had different types of practice, they had different types of theology even, but still all regarded themselves to be brothers and to be regarded as Muslims.
For the Shia, ijma is only an indicator and has no abiding weight. In the absence of the infallible Imam, guidance is found through rigorous, rational examination of the two sources, which is practiced by the most learned religious scholars, whose teaching is then followed by the people. Drawn from these sources, Islamic law came to recognize 5 categories of actions. These are those categories that are obligatory for every Muslim, individually, or fard ayn, for the community, but which can be performed by a group on behalf of the whole, or fard kifaya. Those recommended acts that carry a reward if performed, but do not involve punishment if omitted, or sunnah. Neutral acts which carry neither punishment nor reward, as people are free to choose, or mubah. Actions that are disapproved of, but attract no specific punishment, or makruh. Any action that is clearly forbidden and carries a punishment if it is committed is classified as haram. Let's see how these classifications work out in practice. First, fard ayn. That is something obligatory for every Muslim. For example, the regular rhythm of prayer and fasting during the month of Ramadan. Then, fard kifaya, those actions that a group can perform on behalf of everyone, such as looking for the new moon, or taking part in funeral prayers. Examples of recommended or sunnah actions would be exchanging the greeting, Salam alaikum, performing additional rak'ah,
before or after obligatory prayers, and visiting the sick. Things that are neutral or mubah would include styles of dress, types of diet, or tastes in literature. Smoking would be disapproved or makruh, and drinking alcohol haram or forbidden.
Naturally, there are some variations of opinion regarding the three middle categories. Also, as time goes on and knowledge advances, some actions may well be reclassified. For example, some would classify smoking as forbidden, as it is now known seriously to damage health. As Islam spread rapidly during the 1st century after Muhammad, it encountered different cultures. As a result, considerable variations arose in the way the Islamic code of conduct and the Shari'a developed. A number of Sunni schools of law, or pathways to be followed, or madhabs, sprang up at different times and in different locations. Eventually, these resolved into the 4 existing Sunni schools, which are associated with the influential scholar after whom they were named. For 12 Shia, the Shari'a was largely drawn up by Imam Jafar al-Sadiq.
The Hanafi school was founded by Abu Hanifa, 700 to 767, who lived in Baghdad. It was the first madhab and established and developed qiyas and rai as legal principles. It spread to become the dominant school in the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, Turkey, and formerly the Ottoman Empire, and parts of Egypt. The Maliki school was founded by Malik ibn Anas, 712 to 795, who lived in Medina, where he became the principal imam. Thus it has a strong sense of the connection of the living tradition of Islamic practice in Medina. It is found today in North Africa, parts of Egypt, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The Shafi'i school was founded by al-Shafi'i, 767 to 820, who studied under Malik in Medina, practiced law in Baghdad alongside the Hanafi school, and later settled in Egypt. He is credited with developing the principles of the systematization of Sunni law, later widely adopted by all Sunni schools. It developed the importance of the Hadith of Muhammad as the second source of Shari'a, and greatly enhanced the status of ijma' and analogical reasoning. Today it is the dominant school in Indonesia, Malaysia, East Africa, and parts of Egypt, and in most Arab countries. The Hanbali school was founded by Ahmad ibn Hanbal, 780 to 855, who was a monumental collector of hadith. It emphasizes reliance on the Qur'an and hadith as the principal sources of Shari'a, and gives little room to speculative reasoning. It had a profound influence on reformed puritanical movements. For example, the Wahhabis, initiated by Ibn Abdul Wahhab, 1703 to 1792, which aimed to purge Sunni Islam of what they considered to be innovations, bid'ah. Today the Hanbali school is dominant in Saudi Arabia. The only school within Shia Islam, for those who recognize a line of 12 imams, is the Jafari school. Most of its rulings are traced back to Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, the sixth Imam, 699 to 765. The principal sources are the Qur'an and the Hadith, as in the Shia collections. The Imams provide an additional 300 years of infallible guidance and interpretation of the Qur'an and Sunnah. Shia scholars of the highest rank today have the responsibility, in the absence of the hidden Imam, to guide the people. It has a highly developed place for legal reasoning within its system. Within Islam, there is general agreement between all schools on most of the main aspects of the Shari'a. The school to which a Muslim belongs is largely determined by their family and place of birth.
As times change, new situations arise which pose new challenges for Muslims, just as they do for all of us. Advances in science and developments in society in particular can create moral and ethical dilemmas. When this happens, Muslim scholars examine the question by making a profound study of the principles of jurisprudence, or usul al-fiqh, before going on to study the body of knowledge within their particular school. A scholar of Islam is called an alim, or the plural, ulama, and one who specializes in the study of Islamic law is called a faqih. The science of law in Islam is known as fiqh, which means originally to understand the path, that is, the Shari'a. If an ordinary Muslim is confronted with a question of how to live a Muslim life, then the normal thing to do would be to seek the guidance of a local alim or faqih. This can be done today via a recognized helpline or the internet. A simple query that has been dealt with by the body of scholars can be answered off the shelf. If the problem is something that needs original research and a learned opinion, then the question must be referred to a mufti in the Sunni tradition or a specialist ayatollah in the Shia tradition. These are ulama of outstanding learning. A mufti or ayatollah is capable of using personal judgment to apply the principles of fiqh to a new question. This personal judgment would be given in the form of a fatwa, which is not to be confused with the ruling of a court. This is a learned opinion, and must be respected as such, but it is not necessarily the last word. The same question can be presented to another mufti or ayatollah, and that may bring forward another fatwa, or it may reinforce the earlier opinion. All authority is based on knowledge, not on political or priestly power. In Muslim societies, there is a legal officer called a qadi, or judge, who sits in a court and dispenses justice. A contemporary British example of seeking a fatwa is the question of the acceptability of organ transplants for Muslims. A fatwa was developed and agreed by a body of scholars. Their guidance is that this is an acceptable practice provided that the organ donor is already certified as being dead. Most scholars would agree that although there are some countries in the world that use the title Islamic in their names, there are no countries today that are guided fully by the principles of Islamic law. An Islamic state would be shaped by establishing a system based on the whole spectrum of Islamic law, in which the guidance of God would be implemented within all aspects of society.
Genetically modified crops is one of the new scientific controversies amongst people, among Muslims. People are always debating as to the morality or the ethical issues regarding genetically modified crops. Many people are a little bit concerned that scientists will be playing God. The general understanding among Muslim scientists is that the rationale behind this, the ultimate rationale, is to save human life, to produce enough food in order to feed the millions of people who probably, because of what has happened to our environment, they might not be able to grow enough crops to survive. And therefore, since the ultimate rationale is to save life, and saving life is a particular importance to Islamic faith, then in principle, genetically modified crops is permissible. However, if the basic rationale of the science is just to make profit and that it has consequences for human life in the long run, then of course there are questions to be sorted out. But in general, genetically modified crops are acceptable in Islam.
The Quran and Hadith stipulate punishments for a limited number of major crimes. These are crimes which threaten to undermine the rule of law and the stability of society, such as murder, theft, perjury, sexual misconduct, and drinking alcohol. In specifying the punishments for these, the Quran refers to limits or boundaries, using the term had. In traditional societies, imprisonment did not exist as a form of punishment. Instead, they practiced corporal punishment or financial compensation to the victim's family. Corporal punishment took the form of a beating, or, for the severest cases of theft, amputation. These were carried out in public. The humiliation of the guilty person and the example set to the crowd were as important as the pain endured. In the case of thieves, a hand amputated would serve as an example to everyone who saw them for the rest of their lives. The use of an awesome punishment to drive home the serious nature of a crime can be seen in the case of adultery, for which, under certain circumstances, according to the Hadith, the had is death. The awesomeness of such punishments underlined the serious nature of the act, and was intended to act as a powerful deterrent. To many people outside Islam, they may seem to be harsh. However, it is worth reflecting on the fact that some scholars interpret the had as mandatory, whilst others see it as a maximum, with the actual punishment being at the discretion of the judge, taking into account the individual circumstances and degrees of evidence. In addition, very high standards of evidence are required. For instance, in the case of adultery, there have to be 4 adult eyewitnesses who can testify to seeing the actual sexual act, and the testimonies must agree, or the persistent confession of the guilty person. Naturally, the judge would want to know that the confession was the product of a sound mind, and had not been obtained under duress. One can reasonably ask, what sort of eyewitnesses would stand by and observe such an act of adultery, and why some of them had not acted earlier to prevent it happening? A severe beating was prescribed by the Quran for anyone found guilty of giving false or insufficient evidence in such a case. Before we let the actions of some Muslim people or governments around the world lead us into hasty judgments about Islam, it's worth reflecting on the way Muslims in these societies perceive more liberal countries. Through TV and films, they see a picture of a rich but morally decadent society, corrupted by alcohol, drugs, family breakdown, crime, abuse of sex, and economic exploitation, with many innocent victims, often women and children. Naturally, these are things they want to prevent from entering their societies.